The synchronicity of reflection is incredibly specific to time. When you um, when you think about how it's easy enough for a person to move some objects around on a table and consider it a change, right? A change in state or status or organization of the desk as a system. It's in terms of measuring like percentage of ideal, I guess, right? It's um it's pertinent to the time. Here we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and the the time that that this isolation period is set to time out is variable. So the ways in which we calculate time and make comparisons between healthy people and sick people and counting of objects, things like rolls of toilet paper or whatever. Um, it's a very rational time in that people are inherently preparing themselves mentally and physically for some duration in which they're going to have to be self-sustaining, and so it's an opportunity to look at how we uh, how we interpret an event and how we interpret information and exchanges of information as events. For example, the signature, which is an event, which has a souvenir of a piece of paper. And you compare it to digital currency, for example, which essentially is just a particular arrangement of the colors of the reflection on this CD as I move around. And the two units are not like terms with each other. You know, if you think of this CD as being a coin, for example, um, it's it's got properties in and of itself. It's an integer in that it doesn't need to uh, be attributed a value in order for it to have weight, to displace other coins, to exist. And so it comes back to information in that the the data that is publicly available right now in terms of uh, number of cases, number of deaths, number of reported cases, and the way that media is sort of either decided or obligated to spin this into some sort of context. And I think that a healthy context to have at this time when people are, you know, home alone and bored counting as I'm doing in a series of photographs here to nothing in particular. We don't know what the new normal is going to be. And so it's a good time to calibrate, to take stock of what you've got in terms of, for me, it's storage, right? This is storage. This is what I have. Then have a look at my infrastructures, right? I've got three light sources here. I've got one that's under the desk, I've got one on the ceiling, I've got one that is a flashlight, just in case. And just by activating one or two, I have a whole new combination of information, whole new set of circumstances. And so, what are the constants here in my little system of counting? Well, it's this. Came across this. It's a literal tape measure. right? 60 inches plus a burn on either side. And it's a handy way to think about a volume and to think about surface area and pixelation as being a percentage of a volume, because the entirety of this tape measure can occupy uh, a lot of space or a very limited amount of space with the same inherent limitations to it, right? So a currency or a clock or a response plan that has a basic infrastructure, a grounding, one piece of tape here holding the whole thing together, right? That has that to work from, and a calibration that is specific and that is calibrated. It's periodic, right? 1 millimeter per millimeter sort of thing. And the handy thing about that is that the way that we interpret time on calendars and percentage of man hours and this sort of thing, sort of the combination between objects and networks, um, it needs a bridge. It needs a translation. When you think about things like storage and usage, being billed as real quantities in this day and age, um, some way of modeling that is not an unhealthy thing. And so I've got an irregular object, just a cool little rock, right? And by using this object, this tape measure, as a caliper, right? Almost like a test tube or the bottom of a meniscus might be this level spot here. The change in volume, the change in displacement between sort of a higher or maximum position and a lower or minimum position, that being totally collapsed, and neither one for the sake of a zero, neither one being the natural state of this object, right? It's highly contrived, just like my infrastructure here is highly contrived for the video. And there's nothing wrong with that. You get incredibly specific information with that. And so here I've got a pattern, right, that is a lot like the shape of a screw, right? If you're to think of that, that path that a screw travels down through a piece of wood, except that this is an idealized screw because you can never drill an oblong hole, right? And so the irregularity of it, the buttressing of the if I turn this around and just convert it to hertz, for example, right? If this is a spinning object or a pendulating object, the movement through the camera lens, right, is arbitrary. The distance is arbitrary because there's a real noun here that can be measured independently of the camera. And so because of that, because it's rooted in a real thing, a tangible object, in much the same way that currency isn't digital currency, although it's supposed to be, is something to consider at this time when we're taking stock of our nouns, because here we're in a leap year. February had 29 days, and next year will be the year that the fallout from this time sort of comes through, except that all the money that is being spent now is done in a year in which the dollar is deflated. A man day, a work day, or a triple man day, let's say, three people working 8 hours at a time, back to back, in a shift at a grocery store, for example. that day won't exist on the books next year. There's more hours in 2020 than there is in 2019. There's more supply. And so, without um, making a mountain out of a hill here, it is tax time. And the way that our taxes are periodic, I'm doing my taxes up until last, um, December 31st. And so, as I'm doing that, I'm keeping in mind that, this quarantine time, we won't even be calculating the fallout or the efficiencies that we've made. And if we're going to have a comparison between things that work well and things that don't, um, an origin day that people can sort of agree on as being a constant is that February 29th. And so that's what I'm doing today is I'm thinking about calendars, and I'm thinking about moons of all things. If I look at the full moon on the calendar here, and I compare this to the cross section of the CD, the reflections that you just saw, and the different perspectives, the different lines that I've drawn at, just sort of a rough uh, perimeter, I guess, and having no specific resolution to speak of, except that the full moon on this 22nd Wednesday of April, and with Easter being the weekend before the full moon, as it often is, and with that always being a contentious point in the calibration of schedules, right? With the leap year and with the floating stat holiday. Well, making use of that floating stat holiday and scaling the year as a surface area, literally just with the calendars, much the same way that the tape measure is here, and thinking about my quarantine time not as being a unit of itself, but as a percentage of the year. And doing that now because it's the only time that you can figure these things out. So I'm keeping a journal. I'm keeping a journal of my activities, things that I'm doing now that I wouldn't normally do. For example, looking around at all the standing water on the property and making sure that it's either insectified, I guess, sanitized, or dried out, because stagnant water here, mosquitoes are going to be a real threat in the next week. So that's what I'm doing. This here will be a convenient little metric for comparing hatching times for mosquito eggs versus whether it's working around in the yard or not. I remember I got 4 mosquito bites last year. So we'll see how we do this year. Thanks.